Well, welcome to the Leadership Lounge. It's great to have you with us here again this month. I want to welcome my guest, Trevor Waldock, who is coach, author, and former founder and CEO of Emerging Leaders. I'm delighted to have Trevor with us here today.
Nice to be with you.
And we're going to be exploring the topic of thresholds today. And we often find ourselves in moments of transition as human beings, moments of moving from one thing to another, whether that's a new job, a new moment in life, a new approach at work, or a new way of doing something. And the moment when we process this transition is threshold. And thresholds can feel scary, but Trevor is here today because Trevor has a new book called The Gift of Thresholds, Flourishing Through Challenging Transitions. And he helps us in this book to see the beauty and the opportunity that actually these thresholds can offer us. So Trevor, I'm delighted for you to join us.
Nice to be with you, Colin.
Yeah, it's fantastic to have you here. Trevor, I've known you for a number of years now, and I always feel like when I'm with you, I just learn so much, even in our conversation before we went on live on air. It's just good to spend time with you. So Trevor, I know you quite well, but for those who don't know you, some of our listeners won't know you quite so well. Can you just tell us a little bit about your kind of life journey and your leadership journey so far? Now, you've had quite a long journey, so just in a few moments.
In a few moments. How do you sum that up? Well, let's just focus on leadership. So I was doing leadership things probably from 10 years old, as I remember it, and remember doing things in teenage. Didn't really know what it was, but I now know I was leading things. But I think I kind of was converted to leadership about the age of 19.
Yeah.
And it literally felt like that. I was away for a weekend where a group were being invested in for future leadership.
Yeah.
Even though I didn't know what that was, but I saw the power and potential for writing a different story.
Yeah.
And for the amazing opportunity of making an impact through leadership. So that was the beginning. But then I've spent my life leading and training leaders as an entrepreneur. So I've founded 3 different organizations, both in the public sector and the private sector and the not-for-profit sector. And you mentioned the last one. So Emerging Leaders came out of, I was working in the for-profit sector. I owned a business in London. And out of that, it's a whole other story, but created a thing called Emerging Leaders, was how do we bring world-class leadership development into the world's most vulnerable communities to help young people learn to lead themselves out of poverty. And so I founded that from non-existence into what it is today, flourishing and working in about 25 different countries. And then handed the leadership over that five years ago, about that.
And so if you think through some of the things that you've done, how would you say some of those leadership roles have kind of shaped you as a person and as a leader?
Yes, it's a good question. And I think a number of ways. One is every role has felt like it's required more of me. In a number of different ways. So one, it's required me to do more work on myself, to go much, much deeper, because the issue of the leader's pathology, as I'll call it, kind of heart and character, those issues are the biggest determinant of a person's effectiveness as a leader. And if you look at public scandals or the situations, most people don't fail because they were bad leaders. It's issues of heart and character. So heart and character is the determinant, really, of our leadership, I think, potential. So each role has put pressure on me to do more work on myself. And each role has invited me to go into scary places. I mean, not just physically. I used to, for years, always train with an armed guard in Africa. With emerging leaders, so sometimes they were literally physically scary, but scary in terms of I didn't know much. So when I started working in Africa, I'd go into a community that had been decimated by the HIV pandemic, and to start with, I didn't know any more than sound bites about AIDS. So I had to go through deep learning. I didn't know anything really about fundraising. So each role pushed me into and continues to kind of extend, expand, risk, and move into a place that I didn't think I could.
Yeah.
Probably each one has required that.
Yeah. I think that's really helpful for our listeners just to think on this. Our role as a leader isn't just about those out, is it? It's not those that we are leading. It is us and that reflection on us as leaders, as you've just talked about.
Yes.
And I know from talking and working with you before on that brilliant work from Emerging Leaders, where it talks about, we have to start by leading ourselves before
absolutely.
we lead others, which is kind of what you're talking about there. But
Yeah.
each role going deeper and putting yourself in that vulnerable exploration position as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Tell us a little bit then about what spurred you to kind of write your latest book, The Gift of Thresholds. What's kind of brought this book to fruition? What was the stimulus?
Yes, I can't fully answer that. It was other than probably a couple of thoughts came together at the same time. Often the way where my writing comes from is a thought comes into my head that feels like it's got life in it. I thought, that feels like that's got life in it. And so at one level I was in a transition, another transition, which made me think, you've been here before, you've had other transitions. What were they? What were they like? And here's another one, and it's jolly scary. And so I was wrestling with that. And I think the other thing was, I think that notion that the thresholds that we go through will either enable us to become a bigger person, larger person, access more of our potential, or we'll become a smaller person. And because fear will then run us. And once that begins to happen is we pull ourselves in, we diminish, we kind of lock down a little bit on our potential. So I think there was that. And at a very simple level, I was having a chat with a very good friend. And we were talking, I was talking about the struggles of writing. And he said, well, what if you just wrote like you want to write? And I knew exactly what I wanted to write, which was about threshold. So I just went for it.
So it's something that I guess you became curious about because you were going through one.
Because I was going, yes, I think that was highlighted it. Yeah, but it highlighted, like I say, all the other ones that I'd been through.
Yeah. So that curiosity then enabled you to spot pattern that you've been through some before.
Yes, and an encouragement. I think one of the things about thresholds, there are periods that you go through where it is very scary.
Yeah.
So to be able to say, yeah, but you went through that, then, and you went through that test, and you didn't know what was happening then, or you felt like you didn't know who you were then, or you thought, oh my goodness, is that it? Is that the end of me?
Yes.
Am I on the shelf now?
Yeah.
I thought, yeah, you've had that thought before. This is not a new thought, and you survived. So I think it was encouraging in that way, is to access and think, well, how did you survive? What were important? What are some of the lessons, if you like?
And it's interesting as you've talked through the changes that were evoked in you as you went through various job roles, and as you've just highlighted there is a fear sometimes in change. And I love the way you've just highlighted that we can, in these moments of transition, think that's it, I'm done for, I'm on the shelf. And perhaps our listeners can think about moments when they went through a job change, or if the job change was enforced on them, and then suddenly I find myself, I'm no longer in that role. And because quite often we tie our role up with our identity, even though our role is just a vehicle that carries our identity.
Yeah, it's a massive subject.
That can then cause that trigger and that fear. So I loved reading your book, Trevor. I just said to you before we went on air that in this book I can get a measure how good is the book by how much highlighting there is in there.
Great.
There's lots.
I love to see highlights.
And then it moves even more with a number of tabs, post-it note tabs I put on the top. So there's loads. I really recommend our listeners getting the book and reading this as well as listening to our podcast now.
Thank you.
And I love in your books how you just bring to life some of the meaning and words that are in there. And so I loved how you brought to understand the word threshold.
Yes.
And as I read it, I went, of course, that makes so much sense. And you explained its root meaning of the threshold So can you just tell our listeners a bit about that? Because I found it fascinating.
Great.
Hopefully our
Well,
readers
yeah,
will
it was
as well.
interesting. So I think, and having worked a lot, obviously, in the corporate sector, the word that people use is transition. Whereas I think transition is a very one or two dimensional word and quite sterile, if I'm honest, in terms of what it is. Whereas threshold has a long history behind it. So I live in a barn. It's a converted barn, and you visited there. So at one end there are these massive windows where the big barn doors were, and so there would be a door on the north and the south, basically. So we're recording this, and they're harvesting even as we talk, and all the it'd all be brought in and laid out on the threshing floor. And of course, people then would get their winnowing fork, and then they would open the doors and toss it up, toss it up, toss it up. And as it flew up, the husks would come off and the wind would blow that out, and what you'd be left with was the pure wheat. And so it's a very active image. And the other thing, and we can dig into this a little bit more, is it's what stays and what goes. That's what thresholds do. Is something has to go and something has to stay. And we might get on and talk about caterpillars and chrysalises, but that process, so when you toss the grain up in the air and the husks go, it's like, well, we don't need you anymore. That's done with, that's gone. And the temptation is always we want to hold on to stuff, but some has to, what stays and what goes. And I did a whole chapter around that is in the book, The 18 Challenges Leadership, to just say, look, this is a really big leadership challenge about what do you hold on to and what do you let go of. It's a very important ongoing process in leadership. So threshing was important, I think, for those reasons. The notion of crossing the threshold, we use the word threshold. Well, it's the doorway. It's the point of separation, and the notion of liminal, and the liminal space is that space on that threshold, and it's the space of not knowing. So I'm not here, and I'm not quite here. I'm in this liminal space, and it's a really tough space, and yet it's probably one of the most important places in terms of our own recreation as leaders and our creativity and innovation as leaders all comes out of the liminal space. It's a very, very rich image, I think.
And that's what I loved about it, is you've just re-explained it there, this sense that it is active.
Yes.
In this space we are active, we are threshing, we are throwing stuff up to see what is important to stay in me, in my character, in my heart, in my leadership, and what actually needs to just blow and come away now. It may have been an external at one point, it might have been part of me, but actually is not fit for the next part that I move to. And as you say, the word threshold I think is really helpful, because I think you're right, transition seems to feel I'm either there or I'm moving into the new place. I'm either where I was or I'm going. Whereas this threshold has this sense of
very active
space in the middle of to helping you go through. So thank you for explaining that. Hopefully our listeners have found that as kind of like awe-inspiring as a metaphor as I did. In your book, you also talk about thresholds being a severe mercy. Which was really interesting. They look terrifying to start with, but actually offer us a merciful gift. So I get, and we talked earlier about how sometimes thresholds can feel scary because we're about to move to something that feels new and daunting, and maybe I've never been there before. And you described earlier about going to Africa, which had been affected by the AIDS pandemic, and not really knowing much about it when you step into that space. And some of our listeners perhaps won't be, well, I'm not going to Africa, but I'm about to step into a role or a job that just feels way out of my experience. So that scary bit I can see, but the gift bit, so talk to us a little bit more about the blend of those two.
Well, that is obviously a big subject. So the word severe mercy comes from Sheldon Van Auken wrote a book called A Severe Mercy. And the book is all about I mean, it comes from his own life experience, but it is this notion of something happened to him in his life, which was the last thing that he would want to happen. His wife died. And so it feels like it was a death of her, but it felt like a death for him.
Yes.
It was an ending of everything. And they were deeply, deeply in love. So he didn't know who he was. He didn't know whether there was any more life, where he would go, what would happen. And it was only in the processing of that, and I can't remember whether it was C.S. Lewis, his friend, who said to him that phrase, severe mercy or not. But it was that notion, because of course C.S. Lewis went through the same process in terms of grieving and loss, there is an opportunity here. Now, I don't think we're ready necessarily to hear that at the beginning of the process. Just been talking before I came to you about a very sad marriage situation. And it's difficult to say to someone, this might feel like the worst and most painful thing in your life, but there's also a potential in this for you, in who you are becoming, that you would never have found any other way. And I think there are things, so I think there are thresholds we don't choose. So if someone's been made redundant, you didn't choose that.
No.
So a friend of mine was made redundant from his job, and I had no idea what to do, not a clue. And it's like, well, this is the end, I haven't got income, and all of the worries about security. And what he did eventually, as he processed the threshold, was begin to say, well, I love photography. And I know I can earn a bit of money with photography. Well, what if I became a professional photographer? Not only that, what if I found a way of making photography available to young children of school age and create this program for kids? And so he did that. Became incredibly successful. He ended up selling the whole business and he's still a professional photographer. But if he'd have stayed where he was, he wouldn't have made that leap. It wouldn't have pushed him into that place of a creative idea that manifested itself. So I think there are things that happen to us that we don't choose. And there are opportunities that come to us that we can choose. So when I handed over the leadership of emerging leaders, nobody asked me to do that. I just had a sense that I needed to move to something else, the kind of stuff I'm doing now. I just had and it wasn't that I didn't love what I was doing and passionate about what I was doing. I still am, and 1,000% support the organization. But I thought it needs someone now, having me got it off the ground and it's functioning, with a different set of leadership skills. So nobody made me do that. I chose to do that. So I chose to step into a threshold. But it was equally terrifying. In fact, I would argue probably one of, if not the most terrifying thresholds I've passed through. So I think there are personal ones, work ones, thresholds that you choose, thresholds that choose you.
Yeah. And in each of them, as you said, there is an opportunity that can come from them.
Yeah.
Which, as you said, probably at the time when we're first literally crossing the threshold and going into that space, we're thinking, I don't really want to hear this, particularly if it's come upon us.
I think to just come back to a bit of what we touched on before, I think for me the essence is, how much potential do you have? We talk about people have got great potential and amazing potential, and I'm not sure I believe in unlimited potential, but I certainly believe that all of us have got way more potential than we ever realize. And if you look at that, there are many things in our lives that we look at and think, oh, I couldn't do that, or I couldn't do this. And then we look back and think, well, I did. Actually, I did that.
Yes.
I started playing the piano last September. So, well, I can't do that. Well, now I am. I'm never going to be a concert pianist. But I'm playing stuff that if you'd have asked me this time last year, I said, no way, not a chance, not going to happen. So we have so much more potential. And in every dimension. I mean that emotionally, physically, spiritually, developmentally, in every aspect in terms of who we are, what we contribute. We have so much more potential than we can imagine. And much of it is blocked off from us by our own thinking. So if that's true, what's going to get your attention to kind of knock down the door and go beyond that place of fear, because that's largely what it is. We're frightened, understandably. How do you knock down that voice of fear and go beyond into that deeper conversation, deeper potential, deeper contribution?
And I guess that's the key thing you're trying to draw out in this principle of thresholds. And you talk in your book around the kind of space to explore that.
Yes.
And you mentioned earlier this liminal space. You talked about the chrysalis phase of caterpillar turning to butterfly, this place of opportunity. So how does looking at it in that way help us to then explore, to make that step that you've just talked about?
Yeah, it's interesting. So if you look at a caterpillar basically spends all its day consuming. Eat. It's just consuming.
The Hungry Caterpillar book.
The Hungry Caterpillar. We've all read that to our grandkids, probably our own kids. Okay. Yes, the Hungry Caterpillar. It's this insatiable appetite to consume. Then it reaches a point where it just stops. And you start seeing it hanging off its leaf. And then the cocoon forms around it. And it looks from the outside like it's died. But something's actually going on inside. What happens is it is breaking down. It's having a breakdown. It's having a breaking down. And if you looked inside the pupa at that point, the chrysalis, I call it a gloop. It's just a soggy mess. But that soggy mess is full of what are called imaginal cells. Now, an imaginal cell is a cell that carries the DNA of the butterfly, the potential, who you could be. So what is breaking down, and it's the whole threshold again, what is blowing away, is that old. And all those, if you look at our lives, much of our first half of life, we are reasonably well educated in how to do the first half of life. How to get educated, how to get a job, and that points us in the direction of earning some money, getting some security, being successful, getting relationships, building family, if that's, what we choose. But virtually nobody educates us in the second half of life. And Jung would argue that the second half of life is when your real life work begins. Well, what is that? You say, well, nobody's taught me, nobody's telling me. So there's something in this breaking down process that says, I don't need that anymore. And a lot of that is around our ego identity. That is breaking down. And what is left is the essence of who you could become, how you could contribute. That's in the gloop. And then out of that breaking down, those imaginal cells begin to shape from the imagination what is possible. And at the right time, whoosh, out comes a butterfly. And if you looked at a caterpillar and you looked at a chrysalis, you couldn't imagine a butterfly. But it's always been there. But there is a process that had to be gone through to release our more full potential. So that's why this is so important. And therefore we need the space. The space for the caterpillar is that it goes into this cocoon phase where the old goes, breaks down, and the essence begins to distill and begins to reshape. Now that takes time. I think I mentioned in the book, the research shows that for a serious threshold in your life, it's probably 4 to 5 years. That's why I struggle also with the word transition, because if you look at a lot of businesses and running programs, and we're going through a transition program, and in the next 2 months we're going to move from this to this. Well, it's like that's transformation doesn't happen like that. Is you can't have muck transformation. Takes time, and that's what's going on here. So you need space to do that. If I look at the transition from leading emerging leaders to where I am now, I would concur. I'd say it's taken me 5 years to really move from where I was to where I am right now. And it took time, and I needed space. And I often look back and think, if I hadn't had the space that I created through the transition, if I'd have stayed leading emerging leaders, I would have never had the time. Because the pressure is on you.
Yeah.
It's every day. I've got to be there with these fundraisers, there delivering this program, flying to this country. It would have been on my mind, but I wouldn't have had the space. So I think making the space is vital to do that. And we can talk about it. There's lots of different ways I think we can do that.
So let's pick that one up a little, because what I'm going to try and pull together is some strands for our listeners. So what we've kind of honed out here in your answer is around those perhaps really big transitions for us. You've talked about moving from being, as you say, CEO of emerging leaders to the work that you're doing now around helping developing youth and eldership as all part of that. And as you said, that's taken you a number of years. For other people, there will be these moments of transition. You talked about a job change, which perhaps might not be quite significant. And so I'm kind of wondering, is there a sense for us as human beings that we may go through a series of butterfly moments?
Oh, absolutely.
That shape us as people. I mean, I would say, I'm different now to how I was in my 20s, my 30s, absolutely. My 40s. Now I'm in my mid-50s. I would say I've gone through a series of butterfly moments.
Yes, and that's exactly right. And that's, I hope I argue in the book, is your life is full of these transitions. I mean, moving from a baby to an infant to a toddler. There's a transition, when we're in our latter childhood and heading towards like secondary school in the English system. We go through a transition then. We go through transitions in terms of even teenage and hormones kicking in and then the transition leaving home, starting a job, so you've got all of those, getting into a relationship, having kids, massive transition in a relationship, moving from being the two of you to then having children. My children have left home, huge transition. Marriage breakdowns, all of these, and health breakdowns, they're important transitions. And there are age stage transitions. I mean, there's a transition that we just don't seem to talk about, and it's called the 30-something transition. Actually, the body begins to slow down around 30, and if you look around the age 30, there is a process that goes on. And often, if it's neglected, you watch younger people, they might get sick, or something happens, and it's like, well, what happened there? And it's like, because you were in a transition and you ignored it. The midlife transition, the transition in the kind of later midlife. Do I finish work now? Do I not finish work? And the transitions in the retirement years, quote unquote. So yes, a whole life, and that's why this issue of transitions is so important. It's because we're always in and out. It is cyclical, as it were.
Yeah, and I guess what I want to pull out for our listeners here is whether that's the series of perhaps smaller, evolving kind of thresholds that we might go through, or something quite significant in terms of, okay, I am a CEO in the role that I do, but I'm feeling called, I'm feeling nudged, I'm feeling poked towards something else.
Yes.
That in each of those, there needs to be this liminal space, a time of reflection. So let's go down that little alleyway. How do we create that space for reflection then, whether it's the kind of smaller butterfly moments or the big butterfly moments?
Yes, not one answer to that. I mean, one is not living at a crazy pace. There's some illusion that if you're a really successful leader, you'll be 100% flat out. Well, I don't think any great leader works more than 90% because they work with space. They make space. And you know, we get in some crazy things that, well, I used, obviously, as an executive coach, people would be busy. I said, why are you working in the office this morning? They said, what do you mean? So, well, you've got some, you know, you need some space. So why don't you just go to the local coffee bar? Well, if I wasn't sitting at my desk and I was in a coffee bar, people would think I wasn't working. Well, that's a problem in your head, because the actual thing is you're going to do better work by making a better space. I worked with one guy who was a French guy, fund manager for one of the big banks, and so in his fund, he'd been very successful year on year, but he was kind of, kids were young, and he was just like, I don't think I can keep at that level. Physically, I don't think I can do it. So we kind of worked with that. And he said, I keep getting home, my kid late, and my kids are growing up. And I said, all right, well, let's find, where's the line here? He said, well, I want to be home to read my kids a story. So I said, great, what time do you need to be home? He said, I need to be home by 6:30, 7. Great. What time do you need to leave work? He said, I need to leave by 6. Great. So let's work back from there. The hard stop is 6. And we just worked back through the day. And in the end, he ended up taking like a half an hour, 3/4 an hour walk around one of London's parks each lunchtime. Got home by kids' reading time and was still as successful as he's ever been. And his wife was going to send me a bunch of flowers because she felt like she'd got her husband back and the kids had got their dad back.
Yeah. I sometimes wonder, it's one of the great lies that we get deceived by, that I've got to keep working to be successful. And you're right that when we give ourselves the quality space within our day for that time and that reflection.
So I think that's one bit, But I mean, to me, creating some form of meditation, I would say, is essential for a leader.
Yeah.
And if you look at people like Steve Jobs, they meditated every day. And you could just Google that, how many successful leaders meditate every day.
Yeah.
We don't talk about it, doesn't get shouted about, but they all practice making a deep space. So I think that kind of meditation, I think having a coach is a creation of a space. Having a mentor or a spiritual director creates space.
Yeah.
So I think these, or having an elder in your life, and those conversations are, you put them in the diary and they become sacrosanct because they make a space for you to then reflect and think and process.
And I guess these become minor thresholds, don't they? Minor spaces where you can reflect, what's going on well here, what do I need to let go of, what do I hold on to? All of those things can become part of those everyday liminal spaces, everyday thresholds, moments to reflect. And then what about the bigger ones then? The one if someone of our listeners are facing moments like you were talking about, handing on a role that in your case you'd founded, or in my case, suddenly finding myself ejected from being a head teacher earlier than planned. Okay, and what do I do now then? What's your advice there for that liminal space, that thinking space in those moments?
Yes, not a simple answer to that, other than know that it takes time, to not rush. I think I devote a whole chapter in the book to who's on your team, because to me that's essential. At work you say, oh, well, my team has got these 6 people, 12, whatever it is. Well, I would ask every leader, who's on your team? I remember when we worked a lot and we lived in Africa, we lived in Kenya, then we lived in South Africa to get emerging leaders embedded in East and South Africa, is my wife and I, we created a team. We wrote to a number of people and said, would you be on our team? We just need to be able to talk, to share, to get your input, to scream, shout, and throw the toys out the pram. Just, we need a space. Would you make that space and be those people? So those people were on our team. I would say if you're in a serious transition, think about a therapist, think about a spiritual director. And I use that word spiritual director. It doesn't matter whether you affiliate yourself to any particular region or not. I'm using the word spiritual in the sense of what gives your life meaning and purpose. So whoever you are, whatever your background, what gives your life meaning and purpose? Someone who will work with you at that level. And there's a lot of coaches and a lot of mentors who cannot. So be very careful in who you select. You need someone who's made that journey. So if you're interviewing someone to be your spiritual director or elder or mentor, you might just say to them, can you just talk me through a few of your major life transitions and just get a sense of, yeah, they've been there. I sense they've been there. So who's on your team? For me, that's a lifesaver, even to this day. And getting that regular spot in your diary. I was talking to one leader who'd actually been in therapy to try and process stuff, and he said, I've kind of ended that and all the rest of it. I said, well, for what it's worth, I think leaders should always be in some kind of therapy, because where else will you find a space to process all of those deep feelings that get stirred up when someone hates you or something goes wrong or you put all your money into one thing, and all that digs deep into who you are as a leader. Who are you going to process that with? You need to be with someone who will make the space for you in that. So I'd say create a team. You know, who's team Colin, who's team Trevor.
I love that, Trevor. Thank you. That's really rich there. And just that, what I'm getting a sense of is we need to take ownership of it.
Yeah.
And who am I going to pull in around me to help me reflect that? How am I taking ownership of it in my diary and creating space?
And call it what it is. I was chatting with a leader yesterday and her words to me, she said, I am in a threshold right now. Therefore, this is how I'm treating myself. Very successful leader. And she was saying, I need to manage myself in a different way. There are certain things that are knocking and begging on my time, but I'm just holding loose to those because I need to stay much more focused on these other things. If I don't do that, I won't move through this threshold.
Great. Let's move us on to the bit in your book where you talk about thresholds taking us on to new heights. And it struck me when you talk about the story of Dick Frosby and the Frosby flop. And what struck me as a teenager, I did high jump.
Yes, same
and I'm
here.
afraid to say, I mean, maybe I'm a really good example of this as a metaphor. I was a straddle kicker.
Yes.
So I did straddle, which means I just went one leg up, and I didn't go backwards like the sort of Frosby seems to go sideways with the arm. I tried and I just couldn't do it. Or that's what I was telling myself at the time. And therefore, the highest I got to was 1.41 m. I couldn't clear it.
Get higher.
And in your book, you talk about, of course, he came along and just changed the style of jumping. And it's the style that when we just recently seen the Olympics, haven't we? And you look at all of the high jumpers there, they're all doing a version of that, aren't they, in their style? And you talk in the book about the quote, what gets you here won't get you there.
Yeah, Marshall Goldsmith,
Yeah, and this sense that this threshold is about taking us to new heights. You mentioned earlier about, the chaff comes off, it's blown away. What do I let go of and what takes me on? How important then are these thresholds to get to new heights? Kind of explain that a bit
I
for
think
us.
I may, if I rewrote the book, just be clearer that it's not just, I mean new depths as well as new heights.
Okay.
Because if you think about the potential that's in you, it's in you. How is that going to get liberated? Therefore, it involves more depth work. And therefore, let's say you as a coach, the transitional threshold you go through, the deeper it is, the more work you've got to do on yourself, the more you go to places within yourself that you haven't been to. You now sit in front of a new client and they will pick up, I can get into conversations with Colin that maybe I couldn't in the past because I sense he's been there. So I mean as much around depth.
Yes.
Because I think that's the biggest thing. Has this person in front of you, have they been there? And another example that's shifted out into a more outward facing. So chief execs, I think we'd probably both agree, are responsible for vision, mission, strategy. So the question I would always ask a leader at that level is, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important do you think purpose, mission, vision is for your organization? And they go like, well, 10. I say, great. So what's your mission, vision, and purpose? And they go like, what do you mean?
Yeah, most people have never
And they've never even thought about it.
No.
Well, and then I'm like, I try and find a nice way of saying this. So like, how can you possibly lead an organization into its purpose, vision, and mission if you don't have one? Because if you've been through that deep process within yourself, why am I on the planet? Who am I? What am I about? What am I here to contribute? If you haven't been through that process in your own life, how do you lead your senior team through that process? And the answer is, well, a lot of leaders don't. They hire consultants to do it for them. But the integrity of the organization doesn't grow because the leadership hasn't actually grown. So I would argue that higher means as much, if not more, deeper, because then more of you is free, more of you is available. So I think I can spot transitions in leaders that they're not spotting in themselves simply because I've been there, simply because I can feel it in my conversation with them. So I think there is that, but I think there's also, I think there is higher only in the sense of, I don't want to talk about it in terms of success and those things, but higher as in, I didn't think I could do this. I didn't think I could go there. And now I can. I'm finding myself actually able to be doing something, going someplace that I never thought I could do. And a friend of mine was coaching someone who was, again, very senior in an organization. And out of the deeper form of coaching that I'm talking about here, actually said, you know what? What I really want to do, what I'm really passionate about is kids who don't have opportunity. The result was, at the end of it, he hands in his notice and goes back on one of these, what do you call them, teach first kind of things for professionals. Because he says, well, the way into the future is I need to get experience as a teacher. So that's what I mean by higher. It's like, I hadn't thought about that. That's different.
So there's a sense where, as you was talking about this, I almost went back to your metaphor of the caterpillar and the butterfly. There's that sense as we go deeper / higher that we begin to discover even more of our beauty as a person. I always think of the butterfly as they are beautiful, and you're discovering more of your depth, more of your beauty, more of the qualities of what you can achieve.
I'm going to push that a bit further. I think it is beauty, but it's also making friends with the less beautiful bits.
Right. Yes.
Because it's the less beautiful bits within us that we've spent a lifetime avoiding.
Yeah.
If you look at what drives many very senior leaders, it is ego, narcissistic personality. Well, all of that is an avoidance. It's built around a defense, an avoidance of places in ourselves that are just too painful to go. So if you, with the help of trusted elders, mentors, therapists, whatever, begin to make friends with what feels like the less beautiful parts, you are actually going to liberate more integrity So you're going to liberate more vulnerability. And what is it that Brené Brown says is like the issue for leaders? Vulnerability. You find it through this process. Integrity. You find it through this process of integration. That's what integrity is making friends with parts of myself that feel less beautiful, as well as accepting the other parts that are beautiful. So I think it's, Michael Meade talks about, the pearl and the wound. So you imagine a pearl diver diving down to get the pearl, which is the beauty. He said, the pearl always sits on the other side of your deepest wound. So you want to get your deepest pearl? It will mean making friends with your deepest wound. And that's not an easy journey. But that's what's really available to us. That's why I say there is so much more for us on this journey of life. If we're willing to work that journey, walk that journey, and begin to make friends through the threshold and what it's kicking up with the more entirety of ourselves.
So it sounds to me like self-compassion is an important part of that, and being kind to yourself as part of that process. There was another quote here. You quoted from, is it Lisa Lay? Where you said, we want transformation, but we don't want to change.
Change, yes.
And then you added a sentence, we can't be a part-time or low-cost or fast food threshold crosser. I think that's when you're referring to the muck
yes.
threshold, as in McDonald's and fast food. Transformation requires our all. And I think you've touched on that a little on what you've just said, but this all that we go into any deep reflection of transformation, what's the importance of that then?
Well, it comes down to integrity. It comes down to all of you.
Yeah.
And the gift of the threshold is that it can access more of the all of you so that you can contribute more of yourself to the world. So I think that's the vitality, the importance of it. And you talked about self-compassion. Some people use the word mercy or grace, or it is vital. And the reason why I say it's important is this: is you're going to start looking at bits of yourself that feel uncomfortable. And if you listen to how we talk to ourselves sometimes, if you imagine walking down the street and some tough guy comes along and says to you, hey, you're useless, you're no good, you're whatever, and really becomes abusive towards you at a very personal level. How much will you feel like being vulnerable and opening up to them? The answer is not at all. Well, listen to how we talk to ourselves. Well, we talk to ourselves like that. So do we think those more vulnerable parts of ourselves are going to give up the gold, give up the pearl to us if we keep on treating them like a street fighter does? And the answer is no. So learning self-compassion, self-love is essential. It's essential.
So how do we generate that kindness towards ourselves in order to process our thinking?
Well, there's not a quick answer to that, Colin. For me, it started with coming to realize I didn't treat myself very well. I'm my own harshest critic, harshest driver, and realizing I'm not going to ever make friends with deeper parts of myself if I treated myself like that. So acknowledging to myself, sounds pretty blunt, I really didn't love myself very much. And it sounds a bit pop art to say it, but it's also true. I didn't love myself very much. So having to admit that to myself was a big step. And then say to my wife, I really don't think. And of course, to her, that was zero surprise. Because she could see how it showed itself every day. So that honesty. And then just trying to find a different voice. I tell you what I found really helpful. I mean, it's a shortcut, but Elizabeth Gilbert, she wrote Eat, Pray, Love, Deep Magic, those kind of books. She started a practice called Letter from Love. And you can go on her website and find this out. It's very simple. Every morning, you simply say, Dear Love. So I have a journal. So that's one way, is just write to yourself every morning, Dear Love, what would you have me know today? So most days out of 10, that's how I start my day, with meditation, and then just saying, Dear Love, what would you have to say to me today? And of course, if you ask love, then love doesn't treat you like a street fighter. And it's helped me enormously to simply develop another voice, if you like, in my head, a kinder voice. So as a very practical thing, I would hugely recommend that.
Yeah. And I remember reading a book and coming across that piece and thinking, that is such a helpful but simple question. Yeah, what would love want to tell me today? And just as you were saying that, I thought, yeah, because love actually, even if it's got a difficult message, will always be doing it to lift the person up.
Always. That's always down. You always find, if there's a theme, it's I'm here, I'm with you.
Yeah.
It's okay. Notion of grace. But I think, Stephen Levine, who talks about this, he basically says, without that self-love, without grace, without mercy towards yourself, he said, you got nothing. That change that you want to happen in you, through you to others, it has to start there.
Yeah. Thank you, Trevor. There's another lovely phrase you used in the book, which was the breadcrumb question. Does this path, this choice, make me larger or smaller? And I sense that that's quite an important question to ask as part of this
hugely
threshold transition.
I mean, I've got a number of poems that are kind of life poems, but one of them is Dawn of Markova's poem, I will not die an unlived life. I will not live in fear of falling, catching fire. I will inhabit my days. And so she goes, it's a beautiful poem. And the invitation is to live a bigger life. The invitation is to say, look, there's more of you, Colin. There's more of you, Trevor. There's more. How do I want to find the more? Do I want to settle? I always remember there's a verse in the New Testament section of the Bible. It says, we are those who live by faith, by trust, and are not like those who basically live in fear and shrink back. And it's kind of like we've got this living dynamic. Either we take a step, and that faith might be in something divine, supernatural, or even just faith in your own potential. Am I going to live by faith? Am I going to step into what I don't yet know in the belief there will be some more of me to discover? Or I become more fearful. And what happens is I will shrink back. I kind of double down on well, what's got me here is going to have to get me there. That's what I know. It's what I've done. It's familiar. It's what I'm going to stick with. But of course, that keeps us smaller than we could be.
Keeps us as a caterpillar instead of
well, it could be.
I'm
hesitant because it doesn't mean to say we're going to be nothing. It might be still useful and contributing.
Caterpillar still.
Yeah, exactly. So, but not who we could be. And I love the work of James Hollis, and he more than anyone I know keeps asking you that question: is this decision that you're about to take going to make you a larger, bigger person, or will it make you a smaller person? Whether it's a little decision, let's say something happens at home and I want to get really narky with my wife about something. Even if you just said it to yourself, I've said to myself at that point, Trevor, if you get narky right now, is that going to make you a bigger person or a smaller person? The answer is pretty obvious. It's going to make you a smaller person. It's going to reinforce old patterns and, all right, well, what would larger look like? Well, maybe larger is a bit more forgiving, a bit more graceful. Ask a question, something.
It's interesting, as you were talking there, it just reminded me of your previous book about becoming Mandela, and you have a key question there of who am I becoming? And that phrase, again, fits so nicely with that, isn't it? And it's almost that, who am I becoming? This question goes with it. Am I becoming larger, deeper, or am I becoming smaller?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote Mandela because people look at Mandela and say, wow, Mandela, amazing. And my whole thing, well, he wasn't always like that.
No.
He became Mandela. I said, yeah, but he was inspiring and he was visionary and he was... He said, well, actually, you can learn all those things. And so we all have the potential to become our own version of Mandela, the becoming. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's interesting, you talk there, I think your phrase was, everyone wants to become Nelson Mandela, but nobody wants the 27 years
He's in prison. Yeah, absolutely.
And there is that sense there where that prison was almost his liminal space, that period of that threshold.
Yes.
Where he discovered who he could be.
Yeah.
And I guess in some ways this brings us back full circle to the purpose of a threshold. It's that opportunity, isn't it, to remove the things, the things that will blow away, that aren't of any use for that next stage we're about to enter, and taking that kernel, the really important stuff through.
Yeah, and for a reason. We've not really explored this, but the whole purpose of the book was to say, look, this is for a reason. You exist on the planet for a reason, to make a unique contribution. What is that? What is your unique contribution to the remaking of the world that you and I live in? What is that? And thresholds are what liberates that. And it's, I think I talk about it more in To Plant a Walnut Tree, that book. But they call it the Grail question. And the whole issue of the Grail question, you can read it in the book. But the essence of the Grail question in the Holy Grail was, there was a secret question that you had to ask the Fisher King. And so the question is, who does the Grail serve? And the question I asked is, so who does your life serve? And you might say, well, me, maybe my wife a bit, and my kids. Well, you need to ask them whether it's serving them. But the notion of ask the Grail question, because the answer is the Grail serves those who serve. We are here on the planet to contribute. And in contributing, that is our best, highest version of ourselves. So the two go together. We're not just out there contributing. It's part of us becoming and contributing that becoming. And it's imperfect. And it's that imperfect offering that we are contributing, because actually the imperfect offering is what most people can relate to. Most of us don't relate to someone standing up and making a perfect offering. We go like, well, that's amazing, couldn't be like that. But when someone offers in humility and vulnerability that richness of who they are becoming, I think is attractive.
Yeah.
I think it's like, oh, I'd like that.
Yeah. And therefore, not only is what we're offering serving others, it actually allows others to see the potential of what they could become as well, because it's accessible. Yeah. Brilliant. Trevor, as you said, there's so much more we could explore. In some ways, it's a good place to leave this now so that people go, well, I want to find out more about this Grail question. And therefore, do get the book. Do read The Gift of Thresholds. I think, our listeners and our watchers will find it so helpful and further enlightening. But we always finish our podcast with our top 3 tips on the topic we've been exploring. So, Trevor, what would your top 3 tips be for managing thresholds? Whether they're the little regular little butterfly moments, or whether they are these big chrysalis moments, the liminal spaces where you're really exploring in depth who you want to become. What are your top 3 tips?
I always find that really hard. I could say read the book, and read the book. That would be 3.
Yeah.
Grab yourself a journal and and start spending some bits of time asking yourself, what thresholds have I already been through? Can I identify someone? And they might be simple, and as you just sit with it. You know, often our first answers aren't the best answers or the full answers. So just sit with it for a month and just, well, what are the thresholds I've been through? So I think I would do that. I think I would say team you. Start thinking, who do I need around me? I always say to the leaders, I said, you need a therapist before you need a therapist. Because when you really need a therapist, the last thing you want to do is pick up the phone and find a therapist, because you just feel in such a terrible place. You just really don't want to do that. So get a relationship with someones who can have these kinds of conversations with you. And sadly, I think many of us have very few people that we can have truly deeper, meaningful conversations with. And you can tell that by just listening in on conversations. What the level of conversation is and what the lack of curiosity is about one another's story. So identify your thresholds and begin to get a team around you. And then just begin to be sensitive of, do I hear some sense of a threshold that I may be entering? And that's a big one. I'm just writing a book called Tap on the Shoulder, which looks at that in the midlife, is when life begins to say, hold on a minute. And it might be a dis-ease, maybe it's something terrible happens, but look at what's going on. Even in your leadership role, begin to say, do I still want to be doing this? I start the book, Plant a Walnut Tree, with a leader arriving, I tell it as a story, arriving in Liverpool Street Station in London, and he's very successful. He's doing really well at what he's doing. And he's just thinking, do I still want to be doing this? You know, I've been around the houses on this. I've already and I don't really want to do another chief exec job. So see if you can begin to identify some of those thresholds that may be emerging right now. It's possible, I think.
Yeah, great. Trevor, thank you ever so much for
thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Giving us the time and your wisdom, and I would encourage all our listeners to go and get the book, reflect further. And I think the thing that's struck me in our conversation is just creating that opportunity for space to really think those things through. And the other key one that you mentioned, which is around forming a team around you that can help you explore. And I guess for our listeners, I want to also reflect on that key question around, who am I becoming, and is this step gonna make me smaller or bigger, or, as we've just explored today, actually deeper, and to have the courage and vulnerability to step into that space for people. So
great.
Trevor, thank you
Pleasure.
very much indeed for your time. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us in the Leadership Lounge. We hope you've really enjoyed tuning in on this topic of thresholds, and we look forward to meeting you again next month.